Hello and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Eric Fisher, and this is part 2 of a conversation I had with my good friend, Dr. John Drury. If you haven't yet gone back to the previous episode to listen to that one first, I think that will set up the context, and you probably should go do that. I'll link to that in the show notes if you're somehow discovering this before that. In that conversation, we were talking about spiritual practices, the rule of life, using it to anchor ourselves. We talked a bit about Sabbath practices being a weekly thing, and how that increases our productivity, our deeper connections with our family. And in this conversation, we're continuing on and we're talking about the what and the how-to of a monthly day, a desert day, a quarterly day or two, and even an annual day. We're going to really dive into the how-to of all of those things when it comes to what you should be doing on each of those days, how you can dip your toe in and try those things out, not trying to do it all at once, but picking one thing, a daily, a weekly, a monthly, a quarterly, an annually, and figuring out how to use that to your benefit in terms of a rule of life practice. I had a lot of fun talking over this stuff with John, and in fact, you can kind of get an inkling of where we'll go next because he will definitely be back on the show. But if you've been fighting burnout off and on, like many of us have, I think that you'll find these practices and integrating them will help you out, proactively counteracting that. All right, so picking back up here, we were talking about the Sabbath, and that's the weekly. You said the daily. Let's go to monthly, and this one I actually really, really like. I think this is one that might be, well, no, Sabbath would be the one that I would choose also because I really think that's important. But again, starting...
That's where I started. I mean...
Like you said, 2 hours, that's the thing.
The work week it's called the work week.
Yes.
Right? And so...
That's an easier rhythm, I think. Some people might find it hard to do the same thing every day and find a way to fit that in with like a daily thing, but like a once a week. For
some people, daily might be the last thing.
Yeah.
For some, it's early on, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, when I started weekly, it was 2 hours Sunday afternoon. So it was on the first day of the week in my religious tradition, the way we would name that. And I went and I read Harry Potter because all I knew how to do was read, right? I was in graduate school at the time, right? So all I did was just read something fun instead of work.
For work, yes.
But it's like, come on, I have a little imagination, John. It took me like a couple months of doing that to remember I was a musician. But I already had the time set aside, so it was easier to book. So I started asking my musician friends, hey, can we get together Sunday 2 to 4 and jam? And we would jam Sunday 2 to 4. Jam Sunday 2 to 4 was like a pattern in my life for years. After graduate school, my early years teaching, when I was with kids all the time, 2 hours is the most I could ever protect. You know, the kids had me the other 22 hours of that weekend day, right? So it really stayed on Sunday. It slowly moved over because I had it to Saturday to the Sabbath for other reasons that changed. Partly as my kids got older and Saturday wasn't as horrible. Like Saturday's just really hard.
Yeah.
When your kids are little.
Yeah.
Like, it's just hard. And it felt like work to me. Part of me wished I could redo it and like be a little more present and just enjoy them. But whatever, you know, it's all water under the bridge now. But the pattern of like having the Sunday be kind of the first day of work, but not the first day of the job. So it was like, okay, what's important to me? What do I want to work on a little bit today that's for my job or not for my job? But then I'm gearing up and then I'm not coming in Monday with that whole, you know, and the Sunday night jitters and all that. So for me, I shifted it, but I'm not a fundamentalist about these things. It's like I said, I started with 2 hours and that was life-giving and powerful. And for me, like I said, some people are right-handed, some people are left-handed. I haven't decided which one's which, but we'll say left-handed, right? I needed to start with the stabilizing practice. And in the practice, discovered what was important to me, like music is like, has to be in my life or I'm not happy. I needed the space to even remember that, you know? Because when I was young, I just did it. I just made it happen. And then as I got older, music kind of is just the thing that disappeared. And I had to bring it back in with intentionality and purposefulness. But yeah, monthly's where my brother started. And he learned this from my father, who even wrote a little book. Now, again, I hope this isn't too alienating to some of your listeners, but it was called A Day Alone with God, a dog, D-A-W-G. He wrote a little booklet, How to Have a Day Alone with God, that like was passed around among the kind of pastor world that we grew up in. And my brother picked that practice up when he was a young pastor in the 90s and always had one day every month, a weekday, because he had little kids, right? A weekday when he would go off, and he would always did it in the woods because he's much more naturalist than me. He'd go off in the woods and just spend a day reading the Bible, praying, napping, and usually taking a long hike in the middle of it. And he did this just religiously in both senses of that word.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he did this religiously for decades. And I mean, he was doing this when I was still, like high school, right? He's older than me, 5 years older. And, of course, he's a pastor, so that can count as a work day.
Right.
But actually, like, the fact is like, I've found that people usually can get a day off a week. I mean, it would be called like a personal day.
Once a month.
It's once a month.
Yeah.
It's not a big ask. And actually, it's usually built into your benefits in most jobs. It's called a personal day. It's called a mental health day, which is code for I don't want to go to work today because I'm burnt out.
Yes.
Well, maybe prevent that by having space just for you to exist, right? Again, you might need to be on the weekend. It might only be a half a day at first. It depends. It's going to be different for different people. I did not incorporate this initially. I do it now, but I don't think in months. I'm a weekly guy. Maybe that's being a teacher. So I just but I'm a very weekly rhythms guy. The month is like this meaningless concept to me. I mean, bills, I guess, are monthly, but most of the things in my life aren't monthly.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because I'm a man, I guess maybe for women.
Well, I think some people are thinking, okay, Sabbath is 24 hours and that's weekly. A desert day is once a month, and that's, so weekly versus month, once a month versus 4 times a month. That's one thing. But also I think that the desert day, the day may be a misnomer to some people.
Oh, you're right. So day alone with God, desert day is a term I learned from the Benedictines. The other name I use for it that I got from Ruth Haley Barton is the 9 to 4 retreat, she calls it. The 9 to 4 retreat, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m.
And right there, some people,
helpful.
Suddenly it clicks. Oh, wait a second. That's possible.
Yes.
Like your 2 hours for the Sabbath to start with.
Because if your movement into a more holistic existence is just at the expense of, say, your spouse having to do more for your children, just for those who have families. I know not all your listeners do, but if it's just at the expense of your spouse, it's not actually holistic. It's just robbing from her for you, right? Like that's not holistic, right? It's got to be good for everybody, right?
And that comes back around where then you have to make up.
So maybe I'm
going to
rob from my job.
Yes.
Once a month. And the 9 to 4 is brilliant, right? Because what's the typical, like, I know people work way more than 8 to 5, but usually 8 to 5 is the part of the reason we have to work outside of those hours is because we get interrupted so much during that 8 to 5.
Right.
So that's another discussion that maybe we'll even get into. But that's usually when you're expected to be available, is that 8 to 5. So maybe you have the kind of work where you need to touch base at the beginning and the end of the day, right? You need to do those emails or whatnot, or those check-ins. Like that's fine. We don't have to be rigid about this stuff, right? But that 9 to 4, that says 7 hours, right? That's a 7-hour time. And this is more radical. This is a retreat. This is unplugging. This is radical. That's why I call it the desert day. This is the radical under-stimulation day.
Yes.
This is the phone off, unavailable thing, which sounds crazy. But again, you got a full hour in the morning and a full hour at the end of the day when you're accessible. That's reasonable. That's a reasonable request to make of your family, of your friends, of your community, of your coworkers, that you would be available the first hour and the last hour of the day. In fact, this happens roughly about monthly when we have, meetings or those all-day planning meetings, right?
Right.
And you're not usually as accessible during that time. You're accessible to people you're there with, right? And what are those usually for? Those are usually for more long-term strategizing planning, right? Well, is the same kind of long-term health of the organism that is your body just as valuable? I would think so. So a 7-hour retreat, or the 9 to 4 retreat, the desert day, the day alone with God, that day is so powerful. And airplane mode is your best friend. Maybe even leave the phone in the glove box if you're driving somewhere. Maybe if you're crazy like me, you even leave it behind. Because guess what? We used to know how to drive places before we had GPS.
Yes. I'm not gonna out them, but a friend of ours, his father, who's 20, 25 years older than us, something like that, he tells this story, our friend, that his father was suddenly freaking out because he had forgot his phone at home and they had left to go do something. And then he was like, how am I going to know how to get there? And I'm like, that's a hilarious story that we've gotten to that point.
Yeah.
That's a person who grew up majority of their life. I mean,
Yes.
and like us, like
Yes.
we grew up the first half of our lives at least without.
They even did most of their adult years
Exactly.
without it, and we've transitioned
and yet
so
the
much.
habitualization of it. So yeah, that can be difficult for people.
To me, I think of the monthly thing as a slightly more difficult thing. The Sabbath keeping, once it's only difficult in the transition. Once it's in place, it's just like, oh, this is what I wanted my weekend always to be anyway. Right? It actually, and some people already do it. That's why I'm saying, like, you probably are already practicing this. All you got to do is do it on purpose. And you get more out of it when you do it on purpose.
Yes.
But this one, I tend to think of as something that needs to be done with a little bit more seriousness. Is the benefit? I don't mean austerity and heaviness, but I mean, like, have some really clear boundaries for yourself. And that radical understimulation principle is what really, that term that we used in the last episode is really key for that day. That's why I call it desert day. How am I going to take my stimulation down as close to zero as possible? And that's going to be really jarring, but it's going to be totally life-giving and empowering. I mean, it seems like a waste of money, but like I always have a couple physical copies of like a little Sudoku book that you can buy at the pharmacy.
Yeah. Because
that's one of the things I do to kind of relax on my desert day.
It's analog.
It's analog. It's got to be analog though. I feel like such a stickler, but it really does make a difference because it's so understimulating. It's pure, just kind of like a mathematical puzzle. My wife does literal puzzles. She loves puzzles. Ravensburger quality, those German engineered puzzles, you know. You get her in another company, it's like, oh, the pieces don't fit together, right? You know, like she loves beautiful things, right? She'll do puzzles for hours, right? And that really does relax her mind. It's a low adrenaline flow state, right? Low adrenaline flow state. We usually think of flow state as a kind of high adrenaline style.
Yeah.
Because it's goal directed. Right. Just a little bit more again, she's more goal directed than me as a person, is why she gets more done, I suppose. But because the puzzle does have an end point. But the point isn't getting done. You kind of don't want it to be done.
It's the process.
Right. For sure.
Yeah.
So that kind of, again, I don't know if it is low adrenaline, it might be high adrenaline, but it's low stimulation. And analog. Analog's key. The screens are intrinsically stimulating. It's why we call them screens. Because screens aren't evil. They're not bad, but they do stimulate physically. They have a physical impact on your eyes, your body, your brain. And so the de-screening is really powerful in that time. And, you know, let's be honest, we are always on our kids' case for their screen time, but come on. Remember that ad when we were kids where the dad with the mustache finds the box of drugs, comes to the kid and says, who taught you how to do this? And the kid said, and he goes, you, I learned it from you. I learned it by watching you, right? This favorite, right? I mean, they know. They're learning this from us.
Yeah.
They're learning this from us.
Yep.
We are totally attached to those screens and we justify it. We think our use is the legitimate, responsible form, you know, but it's the screen. The screen is itself stimulative. So that radical understimulation, some analog activities. Again, I take my discs. I play disc golf. So I go to a town when there's going to be a disc golf course.
Going to get on that.
Yes,
location? Do we change it up? Because understimulation, you want to maybe not go somewhere where you're exploring, but maybe you do. I don't know. You
got to know yourself. Again, step one with stabilizing practices is getting them on the frickin' calendar.
Right.
And then go find out what you are, right? If you're someone who just gets so bored with going to the same place, you know, you might need to mix it up more. Or you might need to ask yourself, why do I need to be entertained on this day? Like so there could be a question you want to explore, but figure that out as you go. Locking the time in, protecting it, communicating with your coworkers and family. That's the number one. The cost does not have to be high. No. This is not overnight. This is just during the day. I usually go to a college campus on another town. Now, of course, I work at a college, so maybe I feel more comfortable on a college campus. But I got to tell you, it's the free retreat day is the college campus. Any adult can walk onto a college campus, and it will be assumed that you are there for some event. Because college campuses are kind of open public spaces. Their libraries are usually almost always open. You usually don't have to show an ID to get in. Some do, but very few do they. You can even sometimes book one of the study rooms. Public library can work too, but there's something about a college campus. There's usually a lot of green space. There's usually a chapel. It's usually open all day where you can go and be silent for a little while. Even if you're not a super religious person, actually college campuses are usually comfortable with a variety of religious practice. You know, even the Christian ones kind of grasp that not everyone is cut the same way. So again, there are certainly some college campuses I would not recommend that would be really awkward and weird. But for the most part, you can walk onto a college campus and find a nice bench to sit on or a library to spend some time in. And I just practice hour on, hour off. I have 7 hours and I spend either 3 or 4 of those hours, depending on how I structure the day, kind of doing something kind of on point, as it were. So maybe that's prayer, maybe that's scripture study, meditation. I'm using the word on point so that it has application beyond the more religious kind of practice that shapes my life. I want to be honest about what it looks like for me, but I know these are human practices.
So for some people, it could be contemplative thinking.
Yes.
It can be reading.
Yes.
Maybe
if you don't get to read for your job, do it. I read so much for my job that I can't take books on my desert day because I read for a living. I mean, I'm a teacher and a scholar.
Yeah.
So I leave all the books behind. I don't even take my Greek New Testament. I only take the Bible in English.
It could be journaling. It could be that's when you do it.
I always journal a lot.
If you're somebody who can't
but don't
get into
journal all day. Don't journal for 7 hours.
Right.
Do not do it. Even set a timer. Like I keep I don't have a cool looking watch. I just have a junky old like Casio. And you might want to look into one of those for this day. It's worth it. I remember I told a student, like, you might want to get yourself a watch so that you can put the phone away. Because we'll use the need for alarms as an excuse to have the phone with us.
Right.
Again, airplane mode is sufficient for some, but even then you still got all your games, all the things we do to stimulate ourselves, to not come face to face with ourselves. So, like a little cheap watch or a little alarm clock, take a nap.
Yeah.
Play Sudoku, take a walk, take a lunch with you, fast if you want. Not the fasting where you're skipping a meal to get work done. That ain't fasting. That's just ignoring your body, but choosing to fast. Or not, I don't fast on I eat slow. It's like the one meal I have a month where I eat slow because I'm a fast eater. Because I'm usually talking with people, enjoying it, the social life of, which is fine. It's lovely, but once a month I eat a lunch and I take my time and really taste everything and really, right? So just kind of see that under-stimulating. So you're paying attention to what the day is. So yeah, again, it wouldn't have to be college campus. I'm just describing what I do. You could go to retreat center. Sometimes retreat centers actually will let you come for like $15 for the day, and then you have use of their grounds, and then it's going to be much more silent, much more radical under-stimulation. But a public park, of course, when the winter comes, that's why I like a college campus, because then I can just go and hide in the library or hide in their chapel.
Yeah.
So you can experiment.
Even an Airbnb, I think, would work because the rates are so low, even if you're not staying the night.
I know when Mandy would go do her writing retreat days with her friends, and she would book 2 nights, but only stay 1 night. But she booked 2 nights so they would have the room all the way till the 5.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And it was worth it. It was worth that extra money.
It's probably, again, the way the rates go, they're super low. Mm-hmm. So it could be a very good like retreat kind of a thing. Yeah.
So again, booking the time is way more important, I think, than the location. That's an experiment. Find what works for you.
And
find what works for you.
I think the other important thing here is, and this applies to the things we've already talked about as well as things we're going to talk about, you might not necessarily walk away from a day. You look at it as an experiment and you kind of pick and choose and feel it out and do it again and again and practice. It's a practice that you practice. Multiple meanings of words.
The best practice you can do is the practice you can do.
Yes. But you don't...
Did you catch that? The one you actually can do.
Yeah.
So you just start doing it and you practice it.
But I think the thing is, I know in talking, we've talked about, just like you wouldn't necessarily look to a Sabbath, though it can happen, you're not looking to a daily, weekly, monthly, and the others we'll get to, instance as some kind of lightning bolt moment is going to happen. In other words, expectation is the key I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah, the thing I always say about retreat is expect nothing, expect everything, right? So come in with not just low, but no expectations. This day owes me nothing. I'm just going to live it. I'm just going to be me, because just my existence has value. And the world's existence has value. We don't have to enter into an exchange of commodities where I give value to the world or the world gives value back to me. That's the workism mindset. And workaholism is the minor problem compared to workism, which is an ideology that shapes our whole modern life that's deeply destructive. And one of the forms of resistance to that is a retreat where you come in expecting nothing. Again, not low expectations, no expectations. This day owes me nothing, and I owe it nothing. I just exist. That's the beauty of this day. And my discomfort with just existing and not accomplishing anything is precisely the thing that I'm seeking for that to be overcome. And that's what I'm seeking to be liberated from. So that's not a problem to be solved. My frustration that I'm not getting anything out of this. That's not a problem to be solved. That's actually a disorder in me that needs to be reordered. I was like, ooh, wow, how can I get something out of it? It's like, no, the fact that I think that way is the problem, not the day. The day didn't fail me, right? And I didn't fail the day. I just have a disordered imagination about what constitutes value. And again, even if you can't do this monthly, even just do it once. Although monthlies, there's something about that rhythm that's, again, I know some people who do kind of more like a 6-week, just because of their life rhythms, that makes more sense to them. So there are other ways to do it. But we do a lot of things monthly, right? Like if you go see a therapist, sometimes it's monthly. If you go get a massage, it might be monthly. Bills are monthly. There are certain things that are on that monthly routine. So if you can get it on your monthly, that can just be really powerful. And yeah, come in, expect nothing, but also expect everything. It's this wide open receptivity to surprises. So it could be that there is something significant, a breakthrough, an insight that might come. So don't fight it if it comes, but just know it, to have a wide aperture to the possibilities. This might be the day when you do discover, I need to quit my job and have a whole different career, that lightning bolt could happen. But don't come in knowing what you think that's going to be. If you whenever I go on a retreat thinking I want to get this question answered or this decision made, I'm usually frustrated beyond belief, right? But when I come in, no expectation, but open expectation, anything can happen, and not a strict plan of what I'm going to even do that day, a place and a time and the open space within it, and see what emerges. There's all kinds of surprises, especially in the journaling. But again, don't journal all day, but there'll always be some journaling, and it usually doesn't fail, but often the significance of it I don't discern until after the fact. Usually it's a week or two later where I'm like, you know what? I have different values than I had a month ago. And now I realize it was that thought that I had that afternoon. That was really just the tip of the iceberg expressing something changing in me. Because we're always developing and changing even when we're not conscious of it. It's not like you're only developing on that day. That's not your professional development day. You're always developing. It's just sometimes you're more conscious of it. And there's a kind of raising of your consciousness that can happen on a day when you move toward radical under-stimulation.
Yeah. Is it bad that when you said seeing it as a problem to solve, that I thought, well, isn't seeing it as a problem to solve a problem to solve?
Yeah.
But
through practice.
Yeah, exactly.
Not as, my goal is to solve this problem. So in the next 6 weeks, I'm going to keep doing this thing until it becomes me.
Yeah.
So it becomes part of the way my life is lived. Yeah. I won't mention this person's name, but they said to me once about a retreat feels like, and they were saying, I know this isn't right, but feels like entertaining. It's like, I'm going to entertain myself and wait for a holy moment. And they were saying it as like kind of apologizing, because that sounds great, but it's also like, no, don't entertain yourself. Don't stimulate yourself.
Right.
And don't wait for a holy moment, right? Don't wait for something magical. Expect nothing, expect everything. Just exist, rest, play, be, reflect, do the practices that give you life. And what happens is what happens, right? And it has value, whether there were fireworks or not.
Yeah.
And who knows, it might have more value if there weren't any fireworks. Because maybe it's your attachment to the fireworks that needed to be rooted out.
Yeah.
And you might not realize that until 2 months
good.
later, right?
Yeah. Okay, so that's 3
Yeah.
out of 5.
Daily, weekly,
monthly. So quarterly and annually.
That's briefer, yeah.
Quarterly's the one that you said you were kind of still, that's the aspirational one.
Yeah.
Put that there.
It is. It's there. It's just not consistent. I do an overnight retreat. My wife and I have been talking about maybe doing that as something we do together, to go on a quarterly, because we've gone on a few kind of overnight more like retreat, not like an overnight, like romantic date, but like an overnight retreat where we're doing some more inner work, but talking about it together.
Yeah.
And we've done them and we love them when we do them, but we don't do them as much as we wish. So we've been toying with maybe moving in that direction. But for me, it's been on my rule of life for years. I say quarterly overnight, something where you do actually go overnight. And for me, that was just the same as the desert day thing. It's just a 24 hours instead of a 24-hour instead of a 7.
Yeah.
And that's totally doable quarterly. But again, that might be something you do with your spouse or with a friend or with your family. Right? Just make sure it's life-giving thing. Like we went and got that room one time. That was that kind of a thing. That would fit a quarterly.
Yeah, you're right.
To do maybe, and you could mix it up. You could do one with your buddies once a year, do something with your wife once a year, maybe something alone once a year, and maybe something with work friends where you do some work strategizing once a year. I mean, you could get creative, but some kind of quarterly, because there is something about going overnight. Because the thing about the one thing the 9 to 4 is missing is waking up in that peaceful state. And what happens when you do an overnight retreat is it really, it's that waking up, without an alarm clock, with no kids running around, like just waking up with the freedom of the day awaiting in front of you, And again, you may want to do that trick where you book both nights, even if you only spend one night. Again, just so you don't have to pack fast,
Airbnb is your friend here.
Yes,
the rates, especially if you're doing it with multiple people.
Yes.
Like this place has 4 to 6 bedrooms.
Yes.
It's for each of us, it's $20 a night kind of a thing. And then it's like, that's easy. And you go, we went to Trader Joe's and we went.
Board games, Trader Joe's.
That's what we did. We didn't turn a TV on.
Not once.
I turned a Bluetooth speaker on just to have some music. But that way we wanted to have that. We wanted to listen.
So central to our friendships.
Yeah. So, but we had some great meals and just conversations and just time outside and inside. And
so what that looks like, but something, something life-giving that costs a little more money. Because up till now, everything I've talked about is basically free.
Yeah.
This is the quarterly would be the first one where you'd need to spend a little money because it's overnight. So again, not everyone has to do but I think a quarterly overnight life-giving practice, again, like you can tell that one's a little less developed, but my hunch is a lot of your listeners in the business world, that's the low-hanging fruit for some of them, because that's not a big ask. And they probably have some quarterly rhythms already built in just because of am I correct? The business world's a little more built around the quarter.
Yeah, and I think it would be a little easier to fit it in and say it's a planning day once every 3 months versus even trying to fit in the desert day or the 9 to 4 once a month. They might find doing that one. And then with doing
on the weekend, you don't even have to convince anybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You just say, okay,
the spouse is going to they're not going to find the quarterly an offensive ask. That's
no, that's once every 12 weeks, so to speak. So.
Even if things are a little complicated with the spouse, you can probably pull off a
in fact, and this ties into it, you could almost, and I think I've sneakily, I've done this where I've attached it to an existing event or conference you're already going to. You just go a day earlier to, or add a day, front and back end, whatever. I mean, especially if you can say, oh, wait, so I have to already be here? Okay, well then let me comp that and have, and work may even already cover that day for some reason.
Because you're working extra hours.
Yeah.
You're at a conference. You're working 20-hour days.
I've done it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
So annual, what's that look like?
Yeah. Well, this is where this sort of applies to the quarterly, but it really applies on the annual, is to introduce that distinction that we've talked about, not on the show, but you and I have talked about, vacation versus visitation. And there's a third one. We'll wait on that one for a second. But vacation versus visitation. Sometimes, like from work's point of view, it's all the same. The days you're using off that aren't sick days, right? But the idea that you might go on a vacation with your family perhaps, right? But how often do we then just go and visit family? And maybe you really like your family, but it's not the same. Visitation generates different memories. It uses different energies.
We've all visited family and called it vacation when we knew it was anything but.
And in my experience, when the kids were little, the visitation meant a little more help with the kids. So that was attractive. Whereas you're kind of on your own. I remember hearing a comedian talk about, like, on vacation, when I put the kids in their seat and, get them all plugged in. And then I go around to get in the car and start driving. That's my vacation. Just the walk from the door to the tree. As if to say, when they're little, man, wow. it doesn't feel like vacation, although it is. But again, vacation's not, it's time away from the job. It's not time away from work, the work of parenting, because parenting is work.
Yeah.
And there's that work job distinction. We have more work than we do just our job, but even our work's not our whole life. So vacation, especially when kids are little, are work, but it's the work of making memories. It's the work of quantity time. That's work that's worth the energy, but it does cost you something. But there are different memories, different energies. So remember to vacation and not just visitation, and to know which is which, and to value both, because they both have their own value, but they're distinct. So we always try to know which is which and distinguish them a bit. And then there's the third, which is the vocation. And vocation has a broader, that can include like a work trip. And you might take family on your work trip.
Right.
Sometimes that's a sweet, kind of less expensive way. You only have to pay for their stuff, or the housing's already covered and they just, right? But as a family, we always let them know this isn't a vacation, this is vocation. One of us is working. Just like if we were home and one of us is working and the other one is playing with you, you give them that space. We're doing that. We're just doing it somewhere else, which is fun, but it's not vacation the same way, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it'll be attached to a real vacation. You'll add a couple days on the end. It'll be
right.
And you'll have that. I mean, when we would do work trips with my wife, because she travels more for work than I do, we would have the clear mark when, okay, now vacation proper has begun. And that's when the kids know what the expectations are of attention and affection from her. So making those distinctions can be really helpful, and just know which is which. And for me, now I have the peculiarity of being a professor, so I work massive amounts of hours in my work week during the school year. But then I have much larger blocks of time, of space in the summer, much of which is me doing work, but at my own pace and my own self-direction, where instead of the rigidity of the class schedule and the demands of students during the year. So I have a lot more time, but nevertheless, in my older job, I didn't, and I would always do a vacation, family vacation week, and I'd always fight. And my wife and I would fight sometimes about this, fight to make sure it was a vacation and not just visitation and not just attached to a work trip of hers, right? So I'd really fight for, let's always have like a family vacation.
Yeah.
Some of that was probably just some masculine uptightness. So I wanted something I was in charge of, but that I was the father over. I don't know. It was probably things I should get over. But it was always important when they were littler that we'd have that vacation. Most people do that, but like being intentional about that, saying that's part of my rule of life. Notice this is another one where, hey, that's low-hanging fruit. That's already there. So name it and own it, and maybe celebrate it a little more as a gift that you have that week to do that. But then I always would take a full week retreat. Now that's crazy town. Most people aren't going to do that. That's okay. But I'm just going to say this. If you can go and do maybe a 2 nights away, like a full weekend, maybe at a retreat center somewhere, maybe a meditation retreat. If you're more spiritual, but not religious, as it were, you could kind of do a meditation retreat or a directed retreat at a retreat center of some kind, or maybe go with some friends where you're going to spend the day alone and then hang out with each other in the evening and talk about what you've learned. I have a friend who did that. They'd go on a camping trip and they'd spend the day apart. And then they'd have breakfast, and then they'd do their own thing all day, and then gather back for dinner, and do the campfire thing.
I like that.
So there's lots of ways to do it. But that can't just be a buddy. I mean, they can be a buddy, but it's someone who's going to ask you tough questions.
Yeah.
Right. Someone who's going to ask soul questions, right? And want to go deep and not just like check out in the evening, but really share from the heart what you've been experiencing that day. And you both share. And listen, and not a lot of crosstalk, more just sharing. You may just talk for 20 minutes and they just listen, and then maybe ask a pointed question. Here's what I'm noticing, that kind of spiritual friendship kind of thing can be really powerful. So there's lots of ways to do it. I really believe deeply in the annual retreat beyond just family vacation. Now, it can sometimes be in the family vacation. I remember growing up, one time my dad going off for 2 days. We were doing this long, like 2-3 week vacation out west. And then he went off for like 2 days in it. And my mom and me and the kids went and we ate like fast food every day. So my dad didn't like going out to eat. he liked cooking,
Yeah.
camping, camp cooking. So we'd get fast food and junk food. It was so much fun. Right. And go see movies and kind of do because my dad was like the woodsman and like the austere woodsman. We don't go do what tourists do. We go do tourist stuff for 3 days with my, it was 3 days, 2 nights, tourist stuff with my mom. And my dad was off. I think he might've been writing. It might've been a work kind of thing, but he was definitely alone. It was definitely a solitude time. So you can sometimes build it into the vacation. It could even be really healthy that way.
I was going to say, I know of a couple, he was a pastor. They'd go for their vacations and say, is this his vacation or is this a her vacation? And, and I think it was that they were doing like 1 week there and 1 week somewhere else. And it was maybe an alternating annually. But I think what you're saying is you could do both in the same week.
Absolutely.
Phase 1, phase 2.
Yes.
Which phase are we in?
Yeah. And I mean, for me, like we try to have usually our family vacation now, this emerged over, again, trial and error. I'm describing like 20 years of practice and maybe about 15 years of like really attentive, thoughtful practice. So it took time, but like we've learned, family vacation, that's got to be after my annual retreat because I'm like the best dad in the world after my family, right? My head's on straight. I've dealt with some inner demons. I've got some clarity about what I need to be doing in the world. I've had that solitude need that I just have as a 5 just met at a deep level. So I'm ready to engage. I miss my family after I go on an annual retreat. You know what I mean? I didn't used to, but that was my problem. That got sorted out in 2017. Now I always miss my family on my retreat. I didn't force it. It just, my heart changed. Something changed in me. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just, for me, that's our pattern, right? I do my annual retreat early July, go to the same place every year. Some people, that would be crazy making. They want to go somewhere different every year. That's fine. I want the interior adventure and the stability of the familiar place. So I go to the same place every year and we go on family vacation often just soon after that. And that's become a wonderful pattern, a stabilizing force in my life. And I don't count the days down to summer. I like my job, but I do have moments all year when I'm like, ooh, looking forward to having an annual retreat. Just this sense of like, I need some space I don't have space to work on that thing that I'm noticing in me.
Yeah.
I just don't have the space for it, but I will.
And again,
just knowing it's coming, I don't inflict it on everyone else. It's like, that's going to.
And you're not forcing, like we said earlier, hey, I've got that monthly day. I'm not going to force it and try to hammer it to death through that time either, or the quarterly.
Yeah, of course, the great irony is that same policy, expect nothing, expect everything. That applies for that annual one too, man.
Right.
And that's what I wanted to mention and why I think an annual retreat, even if it's not I go for 8 days because I'm a freak, but total solitude. I meet with a spiritual director once a day. That's it. No other human contact. It's craziness, but I'm a weirdo. Not everyone has to do that. That's not for everybody, but something annual that's a little more extended, even a couple nights. And there's something magical about 2 nights. I'll just say that. You just trust me on that one. Something magical about at least 2 nights. So you wake up in a different place twice and you have at least one day you're waking up when you're not going to pack your bag, right? Somewhere long enough that you actually, quote, move in. So at least 2 nights. I'll just say it that and leave it at there. When you give yourself enough space to slow down enough to experience the kind of slowness, the kind of natural pace the body has, when you have enough time to sync up with Earth's rhythms, because of course, one of the regulators of life is just the Earth itself and the way the sun comes up and down. So one of the things I do is I always sleep with white noise. You might too. I don't know.
I do.
ADD person, of course.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Stimulation, right? That is using a kind of appropriate level of stimulation to block out distracting stimulation. That's an appropriate practice. One time a year, I don't use white noise, and that's on my retreat. That's by design. Okay.
Interesting.
And it's only hard the first night, and then it's fine after that. To allow myself to welcome every distraction, to not, you got to go to a retreat center where you're not going to get lots of stimulation. To hear the birds, and I sleep with the blinds open. I always sleep with the curtains closed. I like it dark. So dark and white noise. On my retreat, I have the curtains open, which means I go to bed when the sun goes down. I never turn my lights on in my room. So once the sun's gone, I don't have artificial light to stimulate me, keep me up. Because even artificial light, though it's been around a long time, is a very foreign thing to the human body and most of it evolutionary history. It's very unnatural. Again, you need 2 nights to experience this. Again, if you're camping, it's almost automatic. As long as you don't, again, bring a lantern and all that crazy junk, right? Maybe a fire, but that doesn't have the
different.
Doesn't stimulate the eyes the way the electric lights do. So I don't turn on my lights in that room. So I stay up late reading or doing Sudoku until I physically can't see, and then I go to sleep. And it takes a while to get to sleep because I don't have that white noise. I'm hearing every little thing. And that's okay. I just get okay. I become okay with that. The fact that there's this noise, because I eventually will fall asleep and it's fine. And wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and then find a way to go back to sleep, you know. Not everyone has to do this. I'm giving an example of the kind of radical practices. And I have no intention of bringing those back into my regular life. I love my white noise. I'm not interested in getting rid of it. It's just once a year engaging in something very different. And what happens in that space is I learn how to relax, how to exist as me without all the hats, without all the trappings. And it's on those retreats that I learn practices, activities, forms of prayer, forms of meditation, forms of thinking and being. I learn new ones that then make it easier to do these other things all year.
Yes.
So the 9 to 4, I kind of know what to do because it's just a mini version of the big, the big one in the summer. And so my monthly desert day looks different. Usually every year it changes a little based on new things that I tried out that summer.
In this longer.
Like, I learned, because I usually learn one new thing. I haven't been doing the white noise thing forever. I haven't been doing the curtains thing.
Yeah.
That was a more recent discovery. And I've brought that in now to my quarterly overnight. I bring that curtains trick in. Yeah. Just little things like that.
So we talked about the 2 hands, and you could go either direction, or honestly, it's probably going to be a mix of both at the same time. And we've got all the different, it was 80% ironed out and 20% aspirational. And it sounds like that's where we're at. I think people have probably gravitated in these 2 conversations. Well, this one conversation split over 2 episodes. They've probably gravitated towards one of the 5 time structural pieces that they could try as an experiment. And so I don't think I even need to ask you, so what would you say to somebody to how to get started? Like, they already heard one that I think appealed to them more, and they heard us talk about the how-to of it. And so honestly, it's really just about saying it's possible, it's doable, and the expectation thing is really, I think, the key.
Yeah, along those lines, I might mention it. This is a little tactic I use whenever I'm, to use the modern term, consuming content. I mean, from where I work in religious circles, right? So like, I call this how I listen to a sermon. Of course, everything's a sermon if it's presenting, but content. Yeah. When I'm consuming content / listening to the word, right? When I'm listening to a word from another, because that's what this was. This was an exhortation, and it was inviting our listeners to say, consider some of this, right? So whenever I'm listening to a word, I always identify 3 things, not 3 points, but 3 categories. What's the one thing, the gratitude, the thing that I'm being invited into that I'm already doing? And I say, thank you. That's already there, right? Then the second thing, that's the challenge. Oh, okay. Yeah, I get that. That hits right across the plate. I need to grow in that area. And then the third thing, which I just call the awakening, that's the new horizon that is just foreign to me. And I'm not ready to start stepping into that. I'm opening up to learn more about it. Does that make sense? So you might want to think, even at the end of this podcast, like, don't rush to the thing you need to do. Stop and say, which of those 5, maybe a couple of those, are already in place? And just kind of breathe a sigh of relief. That's already there. Wow, I work out every day. Or, I go on a family vacation every year and I love it. I look forward to it. Actually, I do a quarterly getaway with my buddies. Okay, you've got something, or I Sabbath in some sense, right? And I just need to maybe mark it more clearly, right? You may have something, and just kind of give thanks for that. And then second, you may have 2 things that are kind of stirring. Recognize, does one seem like you could actually make a move on, like this week? You could actually put something in your calendar. Within the next couple of days, you could actually sit down and sort that out. That's the immediate action. That's that call to action. And there might be something else that's like brand new. You never even thought about it. Don't rush to do that. Just kind of sit that aside and like, I want to learn more about that, right? And just let that simmer for a while. Does that help? That kind of
I love it.
Framework.
Yeah.
So it's the gratitude, the call to action and let that one simmer. That's a new horizon. Don't rush it,
Yeah. Well, John, it's been great. We're definitely going to have to do this again.
I'd love that.
And you've got your own podcast. I helped you kick it off.
Help me start it.
And then I eventually stepped out completely, and that was, I feel good about that. That's how it's supposed to go.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
It's not maybe not
Todd,
for
your producer, was my producer for a long time.
Yes.
He also stepped away.
Yes.
I do not feel abandoned. This was all by design. It's all great.
That's the way.
I have a new job where it fits to bring it in house. So now it's part of the podcast network at the school where I
talk a little bit about what it is in case in case it fits their niche, they'd be interested.
Yeah, it's called Fresh Text. It's been going for 5-6 years now.
Yeah,
and it's weekly podcast, drops on Mondays, and it's parapastor scholars just discussing a seasonally appropriate scripture passage. We just discuss a passage. It's not like a interview. I'm not interviewing someone shelling their book. Sometimes they have a book that they pitch at the end or whatever, but we're just discussing a text. Like, so it's for around Christmas time, we're gonna be talking about that kind of stuff. If it's, around Easter, we're gonna be talking about that, we'll go through, we'll do Psalms, we'll do Gospels. So it's kind of aimed for pastors, but of course about half of our listeners aren't pastors. They just like additional material that's maybe a little bit more advanced because it's directed to pastors. A little more substantive. It's not kind of just your standard kind of cheesy devotional Christian-y stuff, but it's not like so like high level that you can't follow it. It's meant to be relatively accessible. It's a kind of mid-range kind of scriptural study and discussion. Yeah. So, I've found that usually, at least Christian folk who are, church goers looking for maybe a little bit of additional meat to chew on, usually find that they enjoy the show.
Yeah. I enjoyed editing it and then not editing it and listening to it. And for me, it was that hybrid of it's people talking, but also mixed with a sermon. It was that kind of sweet spot Venn diagram of that. So yeah. If that's your thing, you can search for Fresh Text.
Fresh Text.
Anywhere, Spotify, Apple.
All of them.
All the places. So, John, thank you for being here. It's been great.
I loved it. Thanks, Eric.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed listening in on this conversation I had with John. And as you can tell, he will definitely be back. There are a couple different places we could go a little deeper and tangents that we could go on. But of course, we'll structure them first. He and I will have a coffee and we'll chat it out and create an outline, a structure. But I hope that you enjoyed this. And if you enjoyed the first episode, which I hope you listened to already, and if not, again, go and find that one first. I'll link up to that again in the show notes. But if you found this episode and the previous episode helpful in any way, I would love for you to do me the favor of sharing this with somebody that you know needs to hear it. Hit that share button, share it with them in your podcast player app of choice or over on the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next episode.